Alright, so here we are again, still with our flex grow property set at the moment. So let's actually look at flex shrink now, which will allow the items to shrink down, as the name implies, if the container is not wide enough or large enough to contain all of them with their width that they have specified by default. So since we're now basically in the opposite situation here and want our items to shrink, I'm gonna go ahead and say that the container is now only 400 pixels wide, but each of the items wants to take up 200 pixels. And of course, since we have 4 items, that's not possible. And then also I'm gonna go and remove flex grow for now, because that's just not relevant if the container doesn't even have any remaining space. And now I've already saved this, and as you can see, the items actually already shrink down to take up only the space that the flex container provides. So different from the flex grow property here, the property flex shrink, so let's write this down, flex shrink. This is by default actually already set to 1, which basically says, just like flex grow, that the items are allowed to shrink. Now if we set this to 0, which is not the default value anymore, it means they should not shrink. And if we set this to all of the items, of course, then they're gonna overflow the container here. And maybe you can still see the boundary. Let's say the width is 210 to make this a bit clearer. So here you can see the boundary of the flex container, and then the items just overflow it because they are not allowed to shrink if we set this to 0. Alright, so I'm gonna go back to 200 pixels here, and then also I'm gonna allow them all to shrink, or I can just remove this because that's just the default value. But now let's see what happens if I use the second item here, and I'm gonna say flex shrink 2. Now as expected, because it behaves very similar to flex grow, the second item now shrinks more than all the others because the flex shrink value is higher. But let's take a closer look again, just like we did for flex grow. So the other items here, 1, 3 and 4, have now a width of only 115 pixels, which means they shrunk by around 85 pixels. And the second one here now has only around 50 pixels of width. So you might notice that this is not twice as much like you may expect, because the other item shrunk by 85 pixels, the second one by 150 pixels. So it's close to a factor of 2, but it's not really there yet. Now this is because flexbox will only shrink the items to some degree, so to say, and it depends on the content of the element and also its padding. So it's not just going to go ahead and shrink it down if that would actually kind of destroy the layout. So in this case, there's some padding set to each of the items in the base CSS file, which is one of the reasons that this item does not shrink any more than it does right now. So if I go ahead and say that the padding should be 0 for all of them, then you can see that the second item actually does shrink by a factor of 2. So let's see here. The items 1, 3 and 4 have a width of 120 pixels, so they shrunk by 80. And this one has a width of 40 pixels, so it shrunk by 160 pixels, and now we have our factor of 2 here, 80 versus 160 pixels. Now if I go back to the situation we were in before, you can see that item 2 now has a bit higher width again. And if I actually go into the HTML and add some content to this, like I'm going to add the word item here again, then you can see that the width again gets a bit larger, because there's more content in the item, and flexbox is not just going to shrink it down without considering the content and the padding of the item. So basically, yes, it would shrink down by a factor of 2 if you have all other items set to flex shrink 1 and this one to flex shrink 2, like in this case. But flexbox will not just go ahead and shrink it down if you have too much content. So that's something you have to be very aware of. And if you ever notice or wonder about why your items don't shrink more than they do, it's probably because they have too much content, padding and so on set to them. And even if you set flex shrink here, let's say to 9 or something, well, in this case I don't have any padding anymore, so it's going to shrink down really until only the 2 is left, but it's still not going to be a factor of 9 because there would also be a negative number. But you can see that it doesn't really change much anymore. In this case, it doesn't really change anything. That's the maximum that the item can be shrunk, and then flexbox just stops no matter what you put in there for flex shrink. Alright, so this is just something to be aware of compared to flex grow, but the principle is actually the same. So this is just something to be aware of compared to flex grow, where you just don't have that issue with content or padding being too large because you just make the item larger. And in this case, yeah, just remember this whenever you wonder about your items not shrinking as much as you want them to. Alright, so that's all about growing and shrinking items. Now there's only one property left called flex basis, and we're going to look at that in the next lecture.